Welcome to our final presentation on apostrophes, and so let's get started. Here again is a familiar sheet we have seen before many times this slide. We've, in our first series of presentations, talked about how we show the genitive case with an apostrophe. In our last presentation, we talked about the use of the apostrophe when we are making a contraction. And then the final one we're going to talk about today is the least important of the three. And so if you're going to miss one of the broadcasts, skip this one because this is not an essential one to know about. I think it's useful to know, and it's useful to have this in your toolbox of writing tools that you have, but it is not essential, and it may be one that you prefer not to use. Although it's still helpful to know it, because when you look at other people's work and they may come to you and say, hey, is this correct? And you may look at it and go, well, I wouldn't do it that way, but yes, that is a legitimate style choice to make. And when you're looking at other people's writing, you can understand what goals they're trying to accomplish by using the punctuation that they're using. So the first thing to know about point number 3 is that we're talking unusual cases. And the goal here, let me flip forward. Let me actually go forward until we're actually where we're going to be for this presentation, which is about halfway through. So we're going to show that there is more than one in some unusual cases. So when we have the word boy, and we want to show, oh, there's more than one boy, we put an S in it. We do not put an apostrophe S. That is not the way we show plural in English. But when we want to say that I received a B in torts, that might be one way of writing it. What if I want to say I received B's in torts and family law? This would be also an acceptable way of showing this sentence. But sometimes people prefer to do an apostrophe here because, after all, the word B really isn't a word. It's a symbol. So sometimes when people are using symbols, and oftentimes these are letters being used not to form a word, but being used to show a letter. Also numbers, signs, symbols, things like that. People use an apostrophe. Because this looks a little odd to us to have the B next to the S, because after all, it's not really a word. We don't have a vowel in it. And so to add an S to something that isn't a word seems in a certain sense not right. So we'll put an apostrophe. Or how about this? I received a 91 and 2 87s on my final examinations. Okay, we could just do 87s like this, or we could use an apostrophe. Either way would be correct. I added a period and 2. I'm just going to add this here section. To section to my final draft. Okay, well, I am using the section symbol. I could just use a section symbol with the S, or I could use an apostrophe here. So those are some examples of how you can use the apostrophe. It's not essential, though. Another time that we might use an apostrophe when something is actually a word might be this. When how about this? When the British spell theater, they spell it theater, right? Now sometimes people do this by putting it in quotes, because we're really not talking about the concept theater, we're talking about the particular order of letters that are used in to create that word. So we're really not talking about the concept of theater, we're talking about the spelling of the concept of theater. How about this? In my essay, I used, how about this? It's better. My essay contained 4 theaters and 2 cinemas, meaning I used the word theater 4 times and I've used the word cinema 2 times. That could be a way of doing this. And it's a way of communicating. We don't mean that there were literally 4 theaters, the actual building in my essay. Obviously, there's nothing, my essay is just a piece of paper. It can't include buildings. And so that can be a way of alerting the reader, hey, I don't mean the word theater in the ordinary way that I use the word theater. Now, it is fine to do this. It is fine to use the apostrophe in this way. I tend not to, but it's a perfectly valid choice to do. But one thing, oops, I went here. But one thing that is dangerous about following number 3 is that it can lead to what I call an expansion of the concept. But let's go through and let's talk a little bit about this in more variety of detail. So usually when I use the word theater, I am talking about a large building with a stage and lots of rows of seats for people to come in and watch presentations. That's what I mean when I say theater, like 99% of the time. But every now and again, I might want to talk about the way that the English spell theater versus the way the Americans spell theater, or I might want to discuss the etymology of the word theater, or I might want to use it in some other way, just looking at the kind of quirky little spelling of that word. When I mean theater, that 99% of the time, the way I make theater plural, I write theater, and then I put an S on it. If I'm in England and I want to write theater, I'm going to put an S on it. I would not do an apostrophe S here. Sometimes what happens, though, is that people have seen an apostrophe S being used, perhaps incorrectly, perhaps correctly, and then they think, that's the way I'm supposed to do it. And so when maybe the word theater was being used just to refer to its spelling or its appearance in a document or something like that, but the person gets the idea, well, that's how I make that word plural, and then they start using the apostrophe S to make a word plural. That is a very unusual way to make the word plural. And so if you're listening to me right now and you're like, I don't know when I'm supposed to use the apostrophe and when I'm not to. If you are in that category, don't use it at all. Do not use the apostrophe for this purpose at all. Use the apostrophe for contractions, use the apostrophe for nouns in the genitive case. Do not use the apostrophe for any other situation. So if this is confusing for you, walk away. Ignore what I'm going to say, because you don't ever have to do it, and it can cause confusion and the misapplication of apostrophes. Okay, by now let's assume that you're still with me. You're like, yeah, I'm getting the difference that you're talking about. Let me learn more about this. Okay, so while usually a writer is going to use the word for its ordinary meaning, every now and again you're going to use it for some purpose other than its meaning, or you're going to use a letter, a number, or some other symbol. When you use a word for a different purpose, that's kind of off-putting for your audience, because when I see the word theater, I think about that building with a stage and lots of seats for people to watch the presentation. That is my immediate reaction. So if you're going to use it in a different way, it's a good idea to give me some hints that might help me make sense of it. And that's the goal. Again, we're using apostrophes only to help resolve confusion. If it doesn't help with confusion, there's no reason to use it. And so when I'm, in this case, we have Bob is 4. He sometimes writes his B's backwards so they look like D's. If I were to have written this, it looks like there's some letters missing, or maybe I'm abbreviating a naughty word here. So that makes it a little easier for the reader to understand, oh, I mean the letter B, and we mean more than one of it. This is whenever Bob writes a B, he's going to make it backwards and it's going to look like a D. And I wouldn't describe this as incorrect. I'm going to say less preferred because it may be confusing. There are other ways of showing this. What I oftentimes do is put it in quotes. But you do want to in some way distinguish it. If you don't do anything and you just have the B next to the S and the D next to the S, it makes the reader feel, I'm not 100% sure I get what you're meaning. And that's not the goal because there's some ambiguity there. Okay, so let's talk about some challenging apostrophe situations. These are kind of, we've gone through the three main categories we're talking about, and these are some categories that we haven't necessarily spent time talking about. These are names ending in an S and that are in the possessive case. Then we're going to talk about names ending in S and that are plural but are not in the possessive case. And finally, we'll talk about names ending in S that are plural and are also in the possessive case. So, an example of this could be Harris, the last name Harris. Even though it ends in an S, we just have one Harris, Mr. Harris. Or it could be someone's name, Agnes. Even though it ends in an S, there's just one Agnes. Those are examples of names that we have to figure out. How do we make Agnes plural? Let's say we want to talk about Agnes's backpack. Oops. What do? Do we add an apostrophe S? Do we add just an apostrophe? What do we do? Well, we'll talk about that. Also, if it's Ms. Harris's backpack, what do we do here? Do we add an apostrophe S? Do we add an apostrophe? What are the steps? Then we're going to talk about when two nouns possess something together. Let's say you and your sibling share ownership of a dog. It would be incorrect to say my dog because I don't own all of the dog. It would be more correct to say our dog. But let's say I want to refer to you and your sibling. Let's say your name is Bob and your sibling is Mary. Do I say Mary's and Bob's dog, or do I say Mary and Bob's dog? We'll talk about that. Then we're also going to talk about the concept of time and money and how that relates to apostrophes. So let's go forward. Okay, here are some examples of more names that end with an S. The fact is that it's fairly unusual in English for non-plural nouns, even proper nouns, to end in English. This is not a common problem. And because it doesn't come up often, people a lot of times don't remember what the rule is. And so we're going to talk about the rule and we'll go forward. And this is one that's near and dear to my heart because my maiden name is Ferris. So this is one that I have reflected upon, probably more than the average person. And I'm going to tell you the most accepted, the most logical, the safest way of doing it. There is another way that is not incorrect, but it is less preferred. It's less logical. And so I'm really going to encourage you to use the better form. So we'll talk about how do we make Ferris plural? How do we make it, when it's in the singular form, possessive? And how do we make, when there's lots of Ferrises, how do we make them possess something as a group? Okay, so here is the table that should help us. And I have three things. I have a surname. I have the proper name of something that isn't a person's name. And I have a first name. But we'll see the rule's the same. It doesn't vary depending upon what the function of that word is. So here we have in the singular non-possessive form. This is the ordinary form. No one's going to get this wrong. And you see in parentheses I have the number of syllables. Harris, Harris. You can hear the two syllables. Texas, Texas, two syllables. Bess, Bess, one syllable. Let's first of all talk about how we're going to make it plural. Well, we can see that we go from having two syllables in Harris, Harris, when we say in a plural form, we say Harris's. Harris's. 3 syllables. Generally in English, to add a syllable, you need to add a vowel. So if you have 3 vowels in a word, generally speaking, you can't have more than 3 syllables. Sometimes you'll have 2 vowels in a syllable, but if you have 3 vowels, you can't really have 4 syllables. There's a few weird exceptions, but that's the general idea. So, since we want to go take a word from Harris, which has 2 syllables, to Harris's that has 3 syllables, it makes sense for us to add a vowel, and so we're going to add the ES. This is the same rule that we have in English for non-names. If we have the word fox, fox is 1 syllable. Actually, let me write fox over here. Fox, fox. But when we say fox, we say foxes, right? Foxes. Because that X is one of those sounds that we can't, to say fox is hard. It's hard to make it clear that you're saying there's more than one. And so we add this syllable so it's obvious, hey, that final S sound isn't part of my X sound. It's a separate sound. And so you can see the rule here is where we have, when we add a syllable, we're going to add the EX. Another example, let's do the word which. Which. Well, when we say more than one which, we go which as, right? We add a syllable. So singular, it's which. Plural is whiches. 2 syllables, so we add the ES. So really, how we make Harris plural is the same as how we make really any other word in English plural. Let's look at another word. Let's say I have a pass to go to a movie. How do we make it plural? Well, we add a syllable, right? Singular, pass. Plural, passes. We are adding a syllable, so we add the ES. Because we're adding a syllable, we need to add a vowel. Okay, so we're really just following the ordinary rule that we have in English when we have a noun that ends with an S sound. This would also apply if we have a name that ends with an X, or there's some other letters that's applied, but we won't focus on those. So when you add a syllable to the name, you're going to add ES to it. So if we have Harris, and then we have more than one Harris, we have Harris's, we add a syllable, we go from 2 syllables to 3 syllables. We're adding a syllable, so we have to add the E to the S. What would be incorrect would be this, right? That shows contraction, but there's no contraction here. This shows possessiveness, but we're just making it plural. We're not in the possessive form. So adding an apostrophe here doesn't help resolve any ambiguity. In fact, it creates ambiguity because we're using a form that isn't appropriate for the form that we're using, because this is non-possessive and it's not a contraction, so there's no need to use an apostrophe. Let's look at Texas. Of course, there's only one Texas, but if there were more than one Texas, we go from Texas, and we do Texas as, right? We'd have 3 syllables, Texas is. Bess, let's say there were 4 Besses in our class. Bess as, 2 syllables. We go from 1 syllable to 2 syllable. We add a syllable, so we have to add the ES. There are people in this room who would incorrectly do this before you've seen this presentation, Besses. What you are really doing is you are pretending that this is the rule that is applying, but it's not the rule that's applied. And that's what I said before. Sometimes people use this rule and they expand it until the point that's not helpful. When you're using an apostrophe, you always ought to think, is my use of the apostrophe consistent with my goals, or is it making more ambiguity? Well, if I'm using Besses to mean more than one Bess, and it's not in the possessive and it's not a contraction, why would I be using an apostrophe here? That makes it harder for the reader to know what I'm getting at. Okay, now let's talk about the singular form and the possessive. So now we're back to one Harris. So let's say we had Mr. Harris here, and we now have Mr. Harris's car. We do add a syllable, right? So we had Mr. Harris. Now we're talking about Mr. Harris's car. Harris's car. This is one of these cases where we actually add a syllable without adding a vowel. And so we have added a syllable, but we don't add a vowel to the construction. That would, after all, look really weird, wouldn't it? right? So we couldn't do that because that would violate a rule. We know when we have a singular noun and we're making it plural, we add the apostrophe S. There's no reason to vary it. Same way with the word fox. Foxes, passes, was other witches. The witches brew. We add a syllable, we just do add the apostrophe S. So the takeaway is when you have a singular noun in possessive form, there's no reason to do anything other than add the apostrophe S. Now our final one is when we have a plural form and we have possessive form. So we look at our plural first, and we know that when we have the plural form, we're just going to add an apostrophe to the end of it. Okay, so now we're talking about the 4 Harris's cars. Well, you know what? We say this word exactly the same as we say Mr. Harris's car. It sounds exactly the same. Mr. Harris's car. Mr. Harris's car. The 4 Harris's car. 3 syllables. So there's no addition. It sounds exactly the same as this Harris, and it sounds exactly the same as this Harris. It's punctuated differently. It gives us information. We know when we see this that it's not just plural because we have the apostrophe there. We also know that it's not singular because we don't have the E and our apostrophes in the wrong space. So the apostrophe is doing its job of reducing the confusion, reducing the ambiguity. Similarly with Texas, the steps that we go through is we look at the plural form and then we add the apostrophe at the end. It's going to sound just like this possessive Texas, maybe the Texas's state bird is the mockingbird. This is going to sound exactly the same as if we had 4 Texases and they each had a state bird. And it's going to sound exactly the same as this. We're going to start with this as our base and add an apostrophe. And this helps us distinguish from this form and this form and this form. They're all distinct. The apostrophe tells us everything we need to know, so we know by looking at it, this word is plural and possessive. This is singular and possessive. This is plural, not possessive. Let's look at Bess's. Bess's sounds exactly like this, sounds exactly like this, sounds exactly like this. The apostrophe here tells us singular, possessive. This tells us plural, but not possessive because there is no apostrophes. And this tells us plural and possessive. So takeaway is with apostrophe S, we can add a syllable just as we do with the ES. When we have just the apostrophe after an S, we do not add a syllable. So this can be a little chart to help you make sense of the rules. The main thing to remember if you're adding an apostrophe, you need to be either making it possessive or you need to be making it a contraction. Or it needs to be one of those super rare circumstances. And if you can master that, awesome. But if that confuses you, then just leave that one out. Okay, so let's look at some examples here. We're going to decide how to make these words appropriate. We have Doris' eyes are green. I think what we mean here is that the eyes of Doris are green. So we want this to be possessive, but there's only one Doris, so we want singular possessive, right? So let's go back and look. And probably the best comparison here is going to be, so we're looking under singular and possessive. So we know we're going to add the apostrophe S to Doris. So the way to do this is Doris's eyes are green. Texas, and of course there is only one Texas. It has a state flower, so we're going to use the possessive or the genitive case. Texas's state flower is the bluebonnet. So similarly, we have singular and we have possessive. Right here is the version that we need. Texas apostrophe S. Texas's state. I have 3 Harrises in my math class. Okay, we can see the word immediately after Harris is a preposition. So it's not in possessive case because 3 Harrises can't possess the word in. That doesn't make any sense. And we know that with the word 3 that it's plural, so it's going to be plural non-possessive. Plural non-possessive. So this is the form that we need. So we need to add an ES. I have 3 Harrises in the class. Massachusetts's weather can be frosty. Okay, well, there's only one Massachusetts, and it is, of course, is quote unquote possessing its weather, so we do apostrophe S, just like we would have with Texas here. I do not like the Joneses. Well, since Jones ends the sentence, it's not possessing anything. So we're talking about probably a group of Joneses. Maybe it's a family. They're plural and they're non-possessive. So it's like the Harris example. Harrises, Joneses. So I'm going to add ES. I do not like the Joneses' cat. Okay, I'm going to assume for this example that there's a whole lot of Joneses in this family. Because it would be odd if you're just talking about Bob Jones's cat to say the Jones cat. So we're going to assume that it's plural and possessive, and so you can see that we first of all need to make, just like we made Harris's plural by adding ES and then the apostrophe, we're going to make Jones's plural and then add the apostrophe. And so here we've made all of these correct. Here are the questions to ask while you're doing this. When you speak these words correctly, do you add a syllable? Doris's eyes, Doris's. 3 syllables. We added a syllable, so we need ES or apostrophe S. Texas's state flower. Texas is just Texas. Texas's is Texas's. We've added a syllable, so we need an apostrophe S or an ES. I had 3 Harrises in my class. Initially, it was just Harris, Harris. Now we have Harrises. Massachusetts's weather can be frosty. Massachusetts's, we've added 1 syllable there. Jones, I do not like the Joneses. Jones, Joneses. We've added a syllable. I do not like the Joneses' cat. If we had started with this format and now we're deciding it's possessive, we're not adding a syllable because Joneses is already 2 syllables. Joneses, the Joneses' cat. We're not adding a syllable. The next question asked is, what does the speaker mean? Does he mean there's more than one of either the people or the things? Is there more than one Doris? Is there more than one Texas? Is there more than one Harris? Is there more than one Massachusetts? Is there more than one Jones? All of those things are important. And finally, does the speaker mean that the person or the thing possesses something? Does Doris possess these eyes? Well, yes, she does. Does Texas possess a state flower? Again, we talked about in our very first lecture, the term possessiveness is broader in a grammatical sense than it is in a literal sense. Obviously, the state of Texas does not own every single bluebonnet flower out there, but it has that special relationship with that flower. Massachusetts doesn't own its weather, but the weather is tied. It has a relationship with the state of Massachusetts in this sentence, and so we use the possessive sense, even though technically it's from a strictly traditional English meaning, it doesn't quite fit. So here we have the breakdown. Doris does own her eyes. Texas does own the flower. Harris doesn't own anything in this sentence. Massachusetts owns its weather. Jones doesn't own anything in this sentence. Jones, in this sentence, does own a cat. So you can see the syllables that we've added. And we've gone through and separated these. Let's look at the Texas example and also the Massachusetts example, because there are 2 ways of doing this. In the first version, we had Texas possessing the state flower, but we can also use Texas as an adjective. The Texas state flower is the bluebonnet. Both forms are correct. We're using a different grammatical structure, but the meaning is the same. Massachusetts's weather can be frosty, or we can say the Massachusetts weather can be frosty. This might be easier to say, but both can be correct. So you can sometimes take what would ordinarily be a possessive noun and make it into an adjective. The other ones are, I guess we could even do that with the Jones cat. We could say, I do not like the Jones cat, meaning the cat that's associated with the Jones family. So that's another example of that. So it's not wrong to do that. It's a perfectly legitimate choice, but you want to pause and think, which path am I going to follow? Am I going to do the possessive, or I'm going to make it into an adjective? Okay, so we've gone through the name examples. It may be useful to uh, uh, print out this couple slides about names because, again, unless your name ends in an S, you probably don't encounter this problem that commonly. And so hopefully what I've said has made a lot of sense and it will stick with you. But, one of the things about writing English effectively is you have to constantly look up rules. Unless you're a super grammar person, and I certainly am not, I am constantly looking up rules. I constantly forget and double check. I don't write a page. I don't, oftentimes, occasionally I'll write an email and not look something up, but usually I'll look something up when I'm sending an email. It has to start being a part of your, if it isn't already a part of your everyday experience when you're legal writing, to look things up. And you'll find after you've looked something up 5 or 6 times, you'll remember it most of the time. But it's good to have some resources that you can go to and look at this. And of course, your Aspen Handbook for Legal Writers is a very good resource for these types of things. Also, you can Google it. 95% of the time, the Google answer you find is going to be the correct one. Now we're going to talk about when two nouns possess something together. Okay, here we have an example. Bob and Mary start a business together. They own it jointly. They call it the Bo-Ma business. So their company, and you see here we're saying their, which is the possessive form of Bob and Mary, right? Their company is Bo-Ma company. Here and the way we do this is, since they're a unit for the purposes of this, we say Bob and Mary's company is Bo-Ma company. So when we're putting the apostrophe S here, we're putting the apostrophe S in some sense around this whole expression. We don't put it in parentheses, but that's the idea. We're making the whole expression Bob and Mary be in the possessive form. And of course, we're going to reverse the order. We can put Mary first and make Bob second. When we say it this way, we're not saying that it's Mary's company. We're talking about Bob and Mary's company. So that, and it can be ambiguous, so you want to be sure about this. So I guess a separate interpretation could be Bob and Mary's company is Bo-Ma company. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. And you can, again, flip it. Mary and Bob's company, again, this is one unit, being owned together, company is Bo-Ma company. This form would be incorrect. Mary's and Bob's company is Bo-Ma company. It correctly implies that Mary owns a company that is different than Bob's company. Now, it is true that we're saying is here, which implies there's just one company. So you're kind of mixing grammatical signs. This isn't a terrible sin to commit from a grammar's perspective, but it's preferable not to do it that way. If you think that this is confusing because it seems like Mary isn't possessing the company, you can always rewrite the sentence this way. The company, you could say, belonging to Mary and Bob is Bo-Ma company. So there's some workarounds if you think that this is ambiguous in your particular sentence. But this is a better choice. This is what English writers are expecting to see when the company is owned jointly. Keep in mind that if you don't follow these rules, it can have very specific negative effects on your client, because if you write it this way and it's a contract, you're saying there's two companies. Or Mary owns half the company and Bob owns half the company, but they don't own it jointly. There's kind of a division line halfway down the middle of the company. That's saying something different about the legal relationship. And so if you include that in the contract or the whatever the agreement might be, you might find that your client is in a disadvantageous position in the dispute that might arise because you've misdescribed the company. So these grammar points, you may sometimes think, oh, Groover's just splitting hairs. There's no real problem doing it the other way. Well, there can be. It can cost, hundreds of thousands of dollars, whether you put an apostrophe S here or there. Okay, now let's look at this. You may think that because we didn't add anything to Mary up here and we didn't add anything to Bob, that when we are going to use prepositions, we don't have to add anything. And that's not true. Even though we don't say Bob's and Mary's company, we do say his and Mary's company. Bob's and her company. His and her company. Probably would have been better to say their company is Beaumont Company. So while you don't add the apostrophe S to Mary up here, if you're referring to it down here, you're going to say her. It's a little bit of a contradiction, but really in a sense it's not, because even though you're not doing the apostrophe S here for Bob, in some sense you are, because this apostrophe S is applying to this whole expression. So that's the distinction there. It's a little fine point. Now let's talk about a different situation. Here is when we have two nouns possessing different things. So Bob owns a Rottweiler and Mary owns a Doberman. They happen to like to walk their dogs together every day. So Mary is walking her Doberman, Bob is walking his Rottweiler, Mary and Bob are walking together with the Rottweiler and the Doberman. Okay, so here we have our story. Bob and Mary walk Bob's and Mary's dogs. So Bob and Mary walks Bob's dog and Mary's dog. We could also say Bob and Mary walk his and her dogs. You want to make both nouns possessive, Bob's, Mary's, to communicate that there is no joint ownership of the dogs. It's not that Bob and Mary are a couple and they happen to together have a Rottweiler and a Doberman. No, they each, Mary has no ownership interest in Bob's Rottweiler, and Bob has no ownership interest in Mary's Doberman. And so if we had said Bob and Mary's dogs, well, we would be suggesting a legal relationship that doesn't exist. So, and as I said before, this is not a theoretical problem. If you miss this, if you misidentify this in a contract, bad things can happen for your client. So be careful in this area. Okay, so we've talked about the whole name problem, names that end in S. We've talked about when we have two nouns possessing something. And now we're going to talk about the last kind of challenging area, and that is time and money. This has to do with idiomatic expressions we have in English. Okay, we want money, we want time, right? We want to have those things, but we don't usually think about literally time possessing something or money possessing something. But when we're talking idiomatically, and when I use the term idiom or idiomatically, it means when we say something that means one thing literally, but means something else as a practical everyday. We interpret the expression not in the literal way, but in the figurative way. So what is an idiom? An idiom is a group of words established by usage as having a meaning not deducible from those of the individual words. So for example, it is raining cats and dogs. Well, we don't literally mean that there's cats falling from the sky and there's dogs falling from the sky. We mean it is raining really, really hard. Bob is feeling blue. We don't mean that he's literally feeling something that's blue, or even that his skin color is blue. We mean that he's sad. Bob kicked the bucket. We again don't literally mean he took his foot and hit the bucket with it. We mean Bob has passed away. Those are examples of idiomatic expressions. Okay, so let's talk about how possessiveness with time and money work with these idiomatic expressions. Writers sometimes use amounts of time or money in such a way that they require apostrophes, even though literally the time nor the money are possessing anything. For example, we could say, he was given 3 days leave. What we mean is leave of 3 days. And you may recall this was the expression that we talked about. Let's just go back here. So we'll say Doris's eyes are green. Okay, well what we mean is the eyes of Doris are green. That's the other way of doing a possessive expression, by using the of blank construction. Well, here we have 3 days leave. If we can change this around, just like we changed Doris's eyes to the eyes of Doris, if we can change 3 days leave to leave of 3 days and it makes sense, which it does, then we need to use this possessive structure. So remember the of blank construction here. 3 days leave is incorrect. My 2 cents worth. This expression means worth of my 2 cents. Just like eyes of Doris. Since this makes sense, it sounds awkward, we want to have the apostrophe S here. This is idiomatic. It's a little bit tricky to remember because we really don't think of it being true possession. And so this might be one of those ones that you just want to flag and think, okay, I don't have to memorize this rule, but when it comes up, I'm going to be sure to look it up to make sure, do I put an apostrophe here or do I not put an apostrophe here? Just remember there is a rule. If you have any questions, please come raise them in class or come see me during my office hours. These subjects are tricky. They do require practice, and they require looking up the rules on a pretty regular basis until you have a solid recollection of what they are. So keep on plugging away at this. This is something you definitely can master with a little bit of time and effort. But again, if you have questions, please feel free and see me. Thanks for your attention.